No, replied MacNab, without seeming to notice the eagerness of the quartermaster. So much the worse, added Ayrton. Well, inquired Glenarvan, to whom do they attribute the crime? Read, said the Major, handing to Glenarvan a copy of the Australian and New Zealand Gazette, and you will see that the police officer was not mistaken. Glenarvan read aloud the following passage. Sydney, January 2, 1865. It will be remembered that on the night of December 29, an accident took place at Camden Bridge, 5 miles from Castlemaine Station, on the Melbourne and Sandhurst Railway, by which the night express was precipitated at full speed into the Lutton River. Numerous thefts committed after the accident, and the corpse of the guard found half a mile above, prove that it was the result of a crime. And in accordance with the verdict at the inquest, this crime is to be attributed to a band of convicts who escaped, 6 months ago, from the Perth Penitentiary in Western Australia, as they were about to be transferred to Norfolk Island. These convicts are 29 in number, and are commanded by a certain Ben Joyce, a dangerous criminal, who arrived in Australia several months ago in some way, and upon whom justice has not yet succeeded in laying hands. The inhabitants of the cities, and the colonists and squatters of the stations, are warned to be on their guard, and requested to send to the undersigned any information which may assist his investigations. J. P. Mitchell, Surveyor General. When Glenarvan had finished reading this article, MacNab turned to the geographer and said, You see, Paganel, that there may yet be convicts in Australia. Runaways there may be, of course, replied Paganel, but not those who have been transported and regularly received. These people have no right to be here. Well, at any rate they are here, continued Glenarvan, but I do not suppose that their presence need cause us to change our plans or delay our journey. What do you think, Captain? Looking at both sides. Captain Mangles did not answer immediately. He hesitated between the grief that the abandonment of the search would cause the 2 children and the fear of compromising the safety of the party. If Lady Glenarvan and Miss Grant were not with us, said he, I should care very little for this band of wretches. Glenarvan understood him and added, Of course it is not advisable to give up our undertaking, but perhaps it would be prudent for the sake of the ladies to join the Duncan at Melbourne and continue our search for Captain Grant towards the east. What do you think, MacNab? Before replying, said the Major, I should like to hear Ayrton's opinion. The quartermaster, thus addressed, looked at Glenarvan. I think, said he, that, as we are 200 miles from Melbourne, the danger, if there is any, is as great on the southern as on the eastern road. Both are little frequented, and one is as good as the other. Moreover, I do not think that 30 malefactors can intimidate 8 well-armed and resolute men. Therefore, in the absence of better advice, I should go on. Well said, replied Paganel. By continuing our course we shall cross Captain Grant's track, while by returning to the south we should go directly away from it. I agree with you, therefore, and shall give myself no uneasiness about the runaway convicts. Thus the determination to make no change in the program was unanimously approved of. One more remark, my lord, said Ayrton, as they were about to separate. Speak. Would it not be advisable to send an order to the Duncan to sail to the coast? Why, asked Captain Mangles. It will be time enough to send the order when we arrive at Twofold Bay. If any unforeseen event should compel us to return to Melbourne, we might be sorry not to find the Duncan there. Moreover, her injuries cannot yet have been repaired. I think, therefore, that it would be better to wait. Wells, replied Ayrton, without further remark. The next day the little party, armed and ready for any emergency, left Seymour, and half an hour after re-entered the forest of eucalyptuses, which appeared again towards the east. Glenarvan would have preferred to travel in the open country, for a plain is less favorable to sudden attacks and ambuscades than a thick wood. But they had no alternative, and the cart kept on all day between the tall, monotonous trees, and at evening encamped on the borders of the district of Murray. They were now setting foot on one of the least frequented portions of the Australian continent, a vast uninhabited region stretching away to the Australian Alps. At some future day its forests will be leveled, and the home of the colonist will stand where now all is desolation. But at present it is a desert. In this region is situated the so-styled reserve for the blacks. On these remote plains various spots have been set apart, where the aboriginal race can enjoy to the full the privilege of gradually becoming extinct, though the white man is at perfect liberty to invade this reserved territory, yet the black may call it his own. Paganel, who was in his element wherever statistics or history was concerned, went into full details respecting the native races. He gave a long account of the cruelties to which these unfortunate beings had been subjected at the hands of the early colonists, and showed how little had been done by the interference of the government. As a striking instance of the manner in which the Aborigines melt away before the advance of civilization, he cited the case of Tasmania, which at the beginning of this century had 5,000 native inhabitants, but in 1863 had only 7. Studies in Anthropology. 50 years ago, said he, we should have met in our course many a tribe of natives, whereas thus far we have not seen even one. A century hence, the black race will have utterly disappeared from this continent. At that moment Robert, halting in front of a group of eucalyptuses, cried out, "A monkey, there is a monkey." The cart was instantly stopped, and looking in the direction indicated by the boy, our travelers saw a huge black form moving with astonishing agility from branch to branch, until it was lost from view in the depths of the grove. "What sort of a monkey is that?" asked MacNab. "That monkey," answered Paganel, "is a full-blooded Australian." Just then were heard sounds of voices at some little distance. The oxen were put in motion, and after proceeding a few hundred paces, the party came suddenly upon an encampment of aborigines, consisting of some 10 or 12 tents, made of strips of bark arranged in the manner of tiles, and giving shelter to their wretched inhabitants on only one side. Of these miserable beings there were about 30 men, women, and children, dressed in ragged kangaroo skins. Their first movement was one of flight, but a few words from Ayrton restored confidence, and they slowly approached the party of Europeans. The major jocularly insisted that Robert was correct in saying that he had seen a monkey, but Lady Helena declined to accept his views, and getting out of the cart, made friendly advances to these degraded beings, who seemed to look upon her as a divinity. Reassured by her gentle manner, they surrounded the travelers, and began to cast wishful glances at the provisions which the cart contained. Glenarvan, at the request of his wife, distributed a quantity of food among the hungry group. Of these miserable beings there were about 30, men, women, and children, dressed in ragged kangaroo skins. A sham fight, which lasted about 10 minutes, the women urging on the combatants and pretending to mutilate those who fell in the fray. After this had been dispatched, our friends were favored by their new acquaintances with a sham fight, which lasted about 10 minutes, the women urging on the combatants and pretending to mutilate those who fell in the fray. Suddenly, the excited crowd dropped their arms, and a profound silence succeeded to the din of war. A flight of cockatoos had made its appearance in the neighboring trees, and the opportunity to display their proficiency in the use of the boomerang was at once improved by the Australians. The skill manifested in the construction and use of this instrument served Lady Helena as a strong argument against the monkey theory, though the Major pretended that he was not yet convinced. Lord Glenarvan was now about to give the order to advance, when a native came running up with the news that he had discovered half a dozen cassowaries. The chase that followed, with the ingenious disguise assumed by the hunter, and the marvelous fidelity with which he imitated the movements and cries of the bird, was witnessed with interest by the travelers. Lady Helena adduced the skill displayed as a still further argument against the Major's theory, but the obstinate MacNab declined to recede from his position, citing to his antagonist the statement of the Negroes concerning the orangutans, that they are Negroes like themselves, only that they are too cunning to talk, for fear of being made to work. Chapter 38. Wealth in the Wilderness. After a peaceful night, the travelers, at 7 o'clock in the morning, resumed their journey eastward over the plains. Twice they crossed the tracks of squatters, leading towards the north, and then the different hoofprints would have been confounded if Glenarvan's horse had not left upon the dust the black point mark, distinguishable by its 3 trefoils. A piano in the desert. Sometimes the plain was furrowed with winding creeks, bordered by boxwood, which took their source on the slopes of the Buffalo Range, a chain of mountains whose picturesque outlines stretched along the horizon, and which the party resolved to reach that evening. Ayrton urged on his oxen, and after a journey of 35 miles they reached the place. The tent was pitched beneath a great tree. Night had come, and supper was quickly dispatched. All thought more of sleeping than of eating after the fatigues of the day. Paganel, to whom fell the first watch, did not lie down, but, rifle on shoulder, guarded the encampment, walking to and fro that he might the better resist sleep. In spite of the absence of the moon, the night was almost bright with the splendor of the southern constellations, and the geographer amused himself in reading the great book of the firmament, which is always open. The silence of sleeping nature was broken only by the sound of the horses' chains as they rattled against their feet. Paganel was becoming fully absorbed in his astronomical meditations, and occupying himself more with the things of heaven than those of earth, when a distant sound startled him from his reverie. He listened attentively, and to his great astonishment, thought he distinguished the tones of a piano. A few boldly struck chords wafted to his ears their harmonious vibrations. He could not be mistaken. "A piano in the desert," said he to himself, "it cannot be." It was indeed very surprising, and Paganel began to think that some strange Australian bird was imitating the sound of the instrument. But at that moment, a voice, harmoniously pitched, was heard. The pianist was accompanied by a vocalist. The geographer listened incredulously, but in a few moments was forced to recognize the sublime air that struck upon his ear. It was Il mio tesoro tanto from Don Juan. Paganel did not lie down, but, rifle on shoulder, guarded the encampment, walking to and fro that he might the better resist sleep. A twofold surprise. Parbleu, thought the geographer, however strange the Australian birds may be, or even though the parrots were the most musical in the world, they could not sing Mozart. He listened to the end of this grand inspiration of the master. The effect of this sweet melody, in the stillness of the starlit night, was indescribable. He remained a long time under the influences of its enchantment. At last the voice ceased, and all was silent. When Wilson came to relieve the geographer, he found him wrapped in a profound reverie. Paganel said nothing to the sailor, but, reserving his account of the incident for Glenarvan the next day, he crept into the tent. In the morning the whole party were awakened by unexpected bayings. Glenarvan at once arose. 2 magnificent pointers were gambolling along the edge of a small wood, but at the approach of the travelers, they disappeared among the trees, barking loudly. "There must be a station in this desert," said Glenarvan, "and hunters, since those are hunting dogs." Paganel was just about to relate his experiences of the past night, when 2 men appeared, in hunting costume, mounted on fine horses. They naturally stopped at sight of the little party, encamped in gypsy-like fashion, and seemed to be wondering what the presence of armed men in this place meant, when they perceived the ladies, who were alighting from the cart. They immediately dismounted, and advanced towards them, hat in hand. Glenarvan went to meet them, and introduced himself and party, giving the name and rank of each member. The young men bowed, and one of them, the elder, said, "My lord, will your ladies, your companions, and yourself do us the honor to accompany us to our house?" "May I ask, gentlemen, whom I have the honor of addressing?" inquired Glenarvan. "Michael and Alexander Patterson, proprietors of Hotham Station. You are already on the grounds of the establishment, and have but a quarter of a mile to go." "Gentlemen," replied Glenarvan, "I should be unwilling to slight a hospitality so graciously offered." "My lord," interrupted Michael Patterson, "by accepting you will confer a favor upon 2 poor colonists, who will be only too happy to extend to you the honors of the desert." Glenarvan bowed in token of assent. "Sir," said Paganel, addressing Michael Patterson, "should I be too inquisitive were I to ask if it was you who sang that divine air of Mozart last night?" "It was I, sir," replied the gentleman, "and my brother accompanied me." "Well, sir," continued Paganel, extending his hand, "accept the sincere compliments of a Frenchman, who is an ardent admirer of Mozart's music." The young man modestly returned the geographer's greeting, and then pointed towards the right to the road they were to take. The horses had been confided to the care of Ayrton and the sailors, and the travelers at once betook themselves on foot to Hotham Station, under the guidance of the 2 young men. It was a magnificent establishment, characterized by the perfect order of an English park. Immense meadows, enclosed by fences, extended as far as the eye could reach. Here grazed thousands of oxen and sheep. Numerous shepherds and still more numerous dogs tended this vast herd, while with the bellowing and bleating mingled the baying of mastiffs and the sharp crack of stock whips. Artificial selection. To the east, the prospect was broken by a border of gum trees, beyond which rose the imposing peak of Mount Hottam, 7,500 feet high. Long avenues of tall trees stretched in all directions, while here and there stood dense clumps of grass trees, shrubby plants about 10 feet high, resembling the dwarf palm, with a thick foliage of long, narrow leaves. The air was laden with the perfume of laurels, whose clusters of white flowers in full bloom exhaled the most delicate fragrance. With the charming groups of native trees were mingled those transplanted from European climes. The peach, the pear, the apple, the fig, the orange, and even the oak were hailed with delight by the travelers, who, if they were not astonished at walking in the shade of the trees of their country, wondered at least at the sight of the birds that fluttered among the branches, the satin birds with their silky plumage, and the canaries clad in golden and black velvet. Here, for the first time, they saw the menura, or lyrebird, whose tail has the form of the graceful instrument of Orpheus. As the bird fled away among the arborescent ferns, its tail striking the branches, they almost expected to hear those harmonious chords that helped Amphion to rebuild the walls of Thebes. Lord Glenarvan was not satisfied with merely admiring the fairy wonders of this oasis of the Australian desert. He listened with profound interest to the young men's story. In England, in the heart of civilization, a newcomer would have first informed his host whence he came and whither he was going. But here, by a nice shade of distinction, Michael and Sandy Patterson thought they should make themselves known to the travelers to whom they offered their hospitalities, and briefly told their story. Here, for the first time, they saw the menura, or lyrebird, whose tail has the form of the graceful instrument of Orpheus. Nature and art. It was like that of all intelligent and active young Englishmen, who do not believe that the possession of riches absolves from the responsibility to labor for the welfare of others. Michael and Alexander Patterson were the sons of a London banker. When they were 20 years old, their father had said, "Here is money, my sons. Go to some distant land, found there a useful establishment, and acquire in labor the knowledge of life. If you succeed, so much the better. If you fail, it matters little. We shall not regret the money that will have enabled you to become men." They obeyed. They chose the province of Victoria as the place to sow the paternal banknotes, and had no reason to repent. At the end of 3 years, their establishment had attained its present prosperity. They had just finished the brief account of their career, when the dwelling came in sight at the end of a fine avenue of trees. It was a charming house of wood and brick, surrounded by clusters of plants, and had the elegant form of a Swiss cottage, while a veranda, from which hung Chinese lanterns, encircled it like a Roman impluvium. The windows were shaded by brilliant-colored awnings, which at a distance looked almost like masses of flowers. Nothing could be prettier, cozier, or pleasanter to the sight. On the lawn and among the shrubbery round about stood bronze candelabra, supporting elegant lamps with glass globes, which at nightfall illumined the whole garden with a beauteous light. No farm hands, stables, or outhouses were to be seen, nothing that indicated scenes of toil. The dwellings of the workmen, a regular village consisting of some 20 cottages, were a quarter of a mile distant, in the heart of a little valley. Telegraph wires secured immediate communication between the village and the house of the proprietors, which, far from all tumult, was in truth a thing of beauty. The avenue was soon passed. A little iron bridge, of great elegance, crossing a murmuring stream, gave access to the private grounds. A courteous attendant advanced to meet the travelers, the doors of the house were opened, and the guests of Hottam Station entered the sumptuous dwelling. All the luxuries of refined and civilized life seemed to be present. Into the vestibule, which was adorned with decorative subjects, illustrating the turf or the chase, opened a spacious parlor, lighted with 5 windows, a piano covered with classic and modern music, easels upon which were half-finished paintings, marble statues mounted on tasteful pedestals, on the walls a few pictures by Flemish masters, rich carpets soft to the feet as grassy meadows, panels of tapestry descriptive of pleasing mythological episodes, an antique chandelier, costly chinaware, delicate vases, and a great variety of articles of virtu, indicated a high appreciation of beauty and comfort. Everything that could please, everything that could relieve the tedium of a voluntary exile, everything that could remind one of a luxurious European home, was to be found in this fairy abode. It would have been easy to imagine oneself in some princely castle of England, France, or Germany. The 5 windows admitted, through delicate curtains, a light tempered and softened by the shadows of the veranda. Lady Helena looked out and was astonished. The house, upon this side, commanded the view of a broad valley, which extended to the eastern mountains. The alternation of meadow and woodland, broken here and there by vast clearings, the graceful sweep of the hillsides, and the outlines of the entire landscape, formed a picture beyond the power of description. This vast panorama, intersected by broad bands of light and shade, changed every hour with the progress of the sun. In the meantime, in accordance with the host's orders, breakfast had been prepared by the steward of the station, and in less than a quarter of an hour the travelers were seated at a bountiful table. The quality of the viands and the wines was unexceptionable, but what was especially gratifying, in the midst of these refinements of wealth, was the evident pleasure experienced by the young settlers in dispensing to strangers, beneath their own roof, this magnificent hospitality. Australians, native and imported. The young gentlemen were soon made acquainted with the object of the expedition, and took a lively interest in Glenarvan's search, giving also great encouragement to the captain's children. "Harry Grant," said Michael, "has evidently fallen into the hands of the natives, since he has not appeared in the settlements on the coast. He knew his position exactly, as the document proves, and as he has not reached any English colony, he must have been made prisoner by the natives as soon as he landed." "That is precisely what happened to his quartermaster Ayrton," replied Captain Mangles. "But, gentlemen," inquired Lady Helena, "have you never heard of the shipwreck of the Britannia?" "Never, madam," said Michael. "And what treatment do you think Captain Grant would experience as a prisoner among the Australians?" "The Australians are not cruel, madam," replied the young settler. "Miss Grant may reassure herself on this point. There are many instances of their kindness, and some Europeans have lived a long time among them without having any reason to complain of brutality." These words corroborated the information previously given by Paganel and Ayrton. When the ladies had left the table, the conversation turned upon convicts. The settlers had heard of the accident at Camden Bridge, but the band of runaways gave no uneasiness. They would not dare to attack a station that was guarded by more than 100 men. They were confident, too, that they would not venture into the deserted regions of the Murray, nor into the colonies of New South Wales, where the roads are well protected. Glenarvan could not decline the invitation of his amiable hosts to spend the entire day at Hotham Station. The delay thus occasioned could be turned to good account. The horses and oxen would be greatly benefited by their rest in the comfortable stables of the establishment. It was, therefore, decided to remain, and the 2 young men submitted to their guests a program for the day's sports, which was adopted with alacrity. It was a charming house of wood and brick, surrounded by clusters of plants, and had the elegant form of a Swiss cottage. A day's sport. At noon, 7 fine hunters pawed the ground at the gate of the house. For the ladies was provided an elegant coach, and the long reins enabled their driver to show his skill in maneuvering the four-in-hand. The horsemen, accompanied by outriders, and well armed, galloped beside the carriage, while the pack of hounds bayed joyously in the coppices. For 4 hours the cavalcade traversed the paths and avenues of these spacious grounds. As for game, an army of bushmen could not have started up a greater number of animals. Young Robert, who kept close to the major's side, accomplished wonders. The intrepid boy, in spite of his sister's injunctions, was always ahead, and the first to fire. But Captain Mangles had promised to watch over him, a fact which tended not a little to allay Miss Grant's apprehension for her brother's safety. Of all the sports of the day, the most interesting was unquestionably a kangaroo hunt. About 4 o'clock the dogs started a troop of these curious animals. The little ones took refuge in their mother's pouches, and the whole drove rushed away in single file. Nothing can be more astonishing than the enormous bounds of the kangaroo, whose hind legs are twice as long as its fore ones, and bend like a spring. At the head of the drove was a male 5 feet high, an old man, in the language of the bushmen. For 4 or 5 miles the chase was briskly continued. The kangaroos did not slacken their pace, and the dogs, who feared with good reason the powerful blows of their formidable paws, did not venture to approach them. But at last the drove stopped in exhaustion, and the old man braced himself against the trunk of a tree, ready to fight for his life. One of the pointers, carried on by the impetus of his course, rolled within reach of him. A moment after, the unfortunate dog was tossed into the air and fell back lifeless. The entire pack, deterred by the fate of their comrade, kept at a respectful distance. It became necessary to dispatch the kangaroo with the rifle, and nothing but bullets could bring down the gigantic quadruped. At this juncture, Robert narrowly escaped being the victim of his rashness. In order to make sure of his aim, he approached so near the kangaroo that the animal made a spring at him. Robert fell. A cry of alarm resounded. Mary Grant, speechless with apprehension, stretched her hands towards her brother. No one dared to fire for fear of hitting the boy. Suddenly Captain Mangles, with his hunting knife open, rushed upon the kangaroo at the risk of his life and stabbed it to the heart. The beast fell dead, and Robert rose unharmed. An instant after, he was in the arms of his sister. "Thanks, Captain Mangles, thanks," said Mary, extending her hand to the young captain. "I promise to take care of him," replied the captain, as he took the trembling hand of the young girl. This adventure ended the hunt. The troop of kangaroos had scattered after the death of their leader, whose carcass was brought to the house. It was now 6 o'clock, and dinner was in readiness for the hunters, comprising, among other dishes, a soup of kangaroo's tail prepared in the native style. After a dessert of ices and sherbet, the party repaired to the parlor, where the evening was devoted to music. Lady Helena, who was a good pianiste, presided at the instrument, while Michael and Alexander Patterson sang with great taste selections from the latest compositions of the modern musical masters. A fresh departure. At 11 o'clock tea was served in true English style. Paganel, having desired to taste the Australian tea, a liquid, black as ink, was brought to him. It consisted of a quart of water, in which half a pound of tea had been boiled 4 hours. Paganel, with a wry face, pronounced it excellent. At midnight the guests were conducted to cool and comfortable chambers, where they renewed in dreams the pleasures of the day. The next morning, at sunrise, they took leave of the 2 young settlers, with many thanks, and with warmly expressed hopes to see them at Malcolm Castle at no very distant day. The cart then started, and in a few minutes, as the road wound around the foot of Mount Hotham, the hospitable habitation disappeared, like a passing vision, from the eyes of the travelers. For 5 miles farther they traversed the grounds of the station, and not till 9 o'clock did the little party pass the last palisade and enter upon the almost unknown districts of the country before them. Chapter 39. Suspicious occurrences. A mighty barrier crossed the road on the southeast. It was the chain of the Australian Alps, which extend in capricious windings 1,500 miles and are capped with clouds 4,000 feet aloft. Ascending the mountains. The sky was dull and lowering, and the rays of the sun struggled through dense masses of mist. The temperature was, therefore, endurable, but the journey was difficult on account of the irregularity of the surface. The unevenness of the plain constantly increased, and here and there rose mounds, covered with young green gum trees. Farther on, these excrescences formed the first slopes of the Great Alps. The ascent was very laborious, as was shown by the efforts of the oxen, whose yokes cracked under the tension of the heavy vehicle. The animals panted heavily, and the muscles of their hams were strained almost to breaking. The axles threatened to give way under the sudden jolts that Ayrton, with all his skill, could not prevent. The ladies, however, lost none of their accustomed cheerfulness. Of all the sports of the day, the most interesting was unquestionably a kangaroo hunt. Captain Mangles and the 2 sailors rode a few hundred paces in advance to choose practicable passes. It was a difficult and often a perilous task. Several times Wilson was forced to make away with his hatchet through the midst of dense thickets. Their course deviated in many windings, which impassable obstacles, lofty blocks of granite, deep ravines, and treacherous swamps compelled them to make. At evening they encamped at the foot of the Alps, on the banks of a small stream that flowed along the edge of a plain covered with tall shrubbery, whose bright red foliage enlivened the banks. "We shall have difficulty in passing here," said Glenarvan, as he gazed at the chain of mountains, whose outlines were already growing dim in the twilight. "Alps, that is a name suggestive of arduous climbing." "You will change your opinion, my dear Glenarvan," replied Paganel. "You must not think you are in Switzerland." "Then these Australian Alps?" asked Lady Helena. "Are miniature mountains," continued Paganel. "You will cross them without noticing it." The next day, in spite of the assurances of the confident geographer, the little party found great difficulty in crossing the mountains. They were forced to advance at a venture, and descend into deep and narrow gorges that, for aught they knew, might end in a wall of rock. Ayrton would doubtless have been eventually nonplussed had they not, after an hour's climbing, caught sight of a tavern on one of the paths of the mountain. "Well," said Paganel, as they reached the hostelry, "the proprietor of this inn cannot make a great fortune in such a place. Of what use can he be?" "To give us the information we need for our journey," replied Glenarvan. "Let us go in." Glenarvan, followed by Ayrton, entered the tavern. The landlord of Bush Inn was a coarse man, of forbidding appearance, who had to consider himself as the principal customer for the gin, brandy, and whiskey of his tavern, and scarcely ever saw anyone but squatters or herdsmen. He replied in an ill-humored way to the questions that were addressed him, but his answers sufficed to determine Ayrton upon his course. Glenarvan, however, remunerated the tavern-keeper for the little trouble they had given him, and was about to leave the inn, when a placard, affixed to the wall, attracted his attention. It was a notice of the colonial police, detailing the escape of the convicts from Perth, and setting a price upon the head of Ben Joyce, £100 sterling to anyone who should deliver him up. "Indeed," said Glenarvan, "that is a rascal worth hanging." "And especially worth taking," replied Ayrton. £100, what a sum, he is not worth it." "As for the innkeeper," added Glenarvan as he left the room, "I scarcely put faith in him, despite his placard." "Nor I either," said Ayrton. Glenarvan and the quartermaster rejoined the party, and they all proceeded to where a narrow pass wound across the chain. Here they began the ascent. Another death. But it was an arduous task. More than once the ladies and their companions had to dismount, and it was often necessary to push the wheels of the heavy vehicle at some steep ascent, or to hold it back along the edge of some dangerous precipice. The oxen, as they could not work to advantage at sudden turns, had frequently to be unyoked, and the cart blocked to prevent it from sliding back. Ayrton was repeatedly forced to bring the already exhausted horses to his assistance. Whether this exertion was too prolonged, or whether from some other cause, one of the horses gave out during the ascent. He fell suddenly, without an instant's warning. It was Mulready's horse, and when the sailor attempted to help him up, he found that he was dead. Ayrton examined the animal carefully, but did not seem to understand the cause of this sudden death. "The beast must have burst a blood vessel," said Glenarvan. "Evidently," replied Ayrton. "Take my horse, Mulready," added Glenarvan. "I will join Lady Helena in the cart." Mulready obeyed, and the little party continued their fatiguing ascent, abandoning the body to the crows. The next day they began the descent, which was much more rapid. During its course a violent hailstorm burst on them, and they were forced to seek a shelter beneath the rocks. Not hailstones, but pieces of ice as large as one's hand, were precipitated from the angry clouds. A sling could not have hurled them with greater force, and several sharp blows warned Paganel and Robert to be on their guard. The cart was pierced through in many places. Indeed, few roofs could have resisted the fall of these cutting missiles, some of which froze to the trunks of the trees. It was necessary to wait for the end of this avalanche, for fear of being stoned to death, and it was an hour before the party regained the steep path, still slippery with icy incrustations. At evening the cart, considerably shattered but still firm on its wooden wheels, descended the last slopes of the Alps, between tall solitary pines, and reached the plains of Gippsland. Not hailstones, but pieces of ice as large as one's hand, were precipitated from the angry clouds. Divided counsels. All were impatient to gain their destination, the Pacific Ocean, where the Britannia had been wrecked. There only could traces of the shipwrecked seamen be found, and not in these desert regions. Ayrton urged Lord Glenarvan to send an order to the Duncan to repair to the coast, that he might have at his disposal all the aid possible in his search. In his opinion, they ought to take advantage of the Lucknow road, which would lead them to Melbourne. Afterwards this might be difficult, for highways leading directly to the capital would be absolutely wanting. This advice of the quartermaster seemed reasonable. Paganel seconded it. He thought, too, that the yacht would be very useful under the present circumstances, and added that they could no longer communicate with Melbourne after passing the Lucknow road. Glenarvan was undecided, and perhaps would have sent the order that Ayrton so particularly desired, if the Major had not opposed this plan with great energy. He explained that Ayrton's presence was necessary to the expedition, that on approaching the coast the country would be unknown, that, If chance set them on the track of Captain Grant, the quartermaster would be more capable than anyone else of following it. In short, that he alone could point out the place where the Britannia was lost. MacNab, therefore, advocated their continuing on the journey without change. Captain Mangles was of the same opinion. The young captain observed that his lordship's orders could more easily reach the Duncan, if sent from Twofold Bay, than by dispatching a messenger 200 miles over a wild country. The major carried his point, and it was therefore decided that they should proceed to Twofold Bay. MacNab noticed that Ayrton seemed quite disappointed, but he said nothing, and according to his custom, kept his thoughts to himself. Early in the afternoon, they passed through a curious forest of ferns. These arborescent plants, in full bloom, measured 30 feet in height. Horses and horsemen could easily pass beneath their drooping branches, and sometimes the rowel of a spur would ring as it struck against their solid stalks. The coolness of the grove was very grateful to the wearied travelers. Paganel, always demonstrative, gave vent to exclamations of delight that startled flocks of parrots and cockatoos. All at once his companions saw the geographer reel in the saddle and fall to the ground like a log. Was it giddiness or sunstroke caused by the heat? They hastened to him. "Paganel, Paganel, what is the matter?" cried Lord Glenarvan. "The matter is, my dear friend," replied Paganel, extricating himself from the stirrups, "that I no longer have a horse." "What, your horse?" "Is dead, stricken like Mulready's." At once Glenarvan, Captain Mangles, and Wilson examined the animal. Paganel was right. His horse had been suddenly stricken dead. "This is singular," said the captain. "Very singular indeed," muttered the major. Glenarvan could not restrain a feeling of uneasiness at this strange occurrence. It was impossible for them to retrace their steps in this desert, while, if an epidemic were to seize all the horses, it would be very difficult to continue the journey. Before the end of the day his fears seemed to be justified. A third horse, Wilson's, fell dead, and what was worse, one of the oxen was also stricken. Their means of conveyance now consisted of only 3 oxen and 4 horses. A fine fernery. The situation had grown serious. The mounted horsemen could, of course, take turns in traveling on foot, but if it should be necessary to leave the cart behind, what would become of the ladies? Could they accomplish the 120 miles that still separated them from Twofold Bay? Captain Mangles and Glenarvan anxiously examined the remaining horses. Perhaps preventives might be found against new calamities. No sign of disease, however, could be detected. The animals were in perfect health, and bravely endured the hardships of the journey. Glenarvan, therefore, was inclined to think that this mysterious epidemic would have no more victims. This was Ayrton's opinion too, who declared that he could not at all understand the cause of the frightful mortality. They started again, and the cart served to convey the pedestrians, who rode in it by turns. At evening, after a journey of only 10 miles, the signal to halt was given, the encampment arranged, and the night was passed comfortably beneath a large group of arborescent ferns, among whose branches fluttered enormous bats. The next day they made an excellent beginning, and accomplished 15 miles. Everything led them to hope that they would encamp that evening on the banks of the snowy river. Evening came, and a fog, clearly defined against the horizon, marked the course of the long-looked-for stream. A forest of tall trees was seen at a bend in the road, behind a moderate elevation. Ayrton guided his oxen towards the tall trunks dimly discerned in the shadow, and was just passing the boundary of the wood, when the cart sank into the earth to the hubs. "What is the matter?" asked Glenarvan, when he perceived that the cart had come to a stop. "We are fast in the mud," replied Ayrton. He urged his oxen with voice and whip, but they were up to their knees in the mire, and could not stir. "Let us encamp here," said Captain Mangles. "That is the best plan," answered Ayrton. "Tomorrow, at daybreak, we can see to extricate ourselves." Early in the afternoon, they passed through a curious forest of ferns. These arborescent plants, in full bloom, measured 30 feet in height. Flashes of lightning, the dazzling forerunners of a coming storm, every now and then illumined the horizon. "Very well, be it so," replied Glenarvan. Night had set in rapidly after a short twilight, but the heat had not departed with the sun. The air was heavy with stifling mists. Flashes of lightning, the dazzling forerunners of a coming storm, every now and then illumined the horizon. The beds were prepared, and the sunken cart was made as comfortable as possible. The somber arch of the great trees sheltered the tent of the travelers. Provided no rain fell, they would have no reason to complain. Ayrton succeeded with difficulty in extricating his 3 oxen from the mud, in which they had by this time sunk to their flanks. The quartermaster picketed them with the 4 horses, and would allow no one to give them their fodder. This service he performed himself with great exactness, and that evening Glenarvan observed that his care was redoubled, for which he thanked him, as the preservation of the team was of paramount importance. Meantime, the travelers partook of a hasty supper. Fatigue and heat had driven away hunger, and they needed rest more than nourishment. Lady Helena and Miss Grant, wishing their companions good night, retired to their accustomed bedroom. As for the men, some crawled under the tent, while others stretched themselves on the thick grass at the foot of the trees. Gradually, each sank into a heavy sleep. The darkness increased beneath the curtain of dense clouds that covered the sky. Not a breath of air was felt. The silence of the night was only interrupted by the occasional howlings of wild animals. About 11 o'clock, after an uneasy slumber, the Major awoke. His half-closed eyes were attracted by a dim light that flickered beneath the great trees. One would have thought it was a whitish sheet, glittering like the surface of a lake. Mac Nab imagined, at first, that the flames of a conflagration were spreading over the ground. Strange sights and sounds. He rose and walked towards the wood. His surprise was great when he found himself in the presence of a purely natural phenomenon. Before him extended an immense field of mushrooms, which emitted phosphorescent flashes. The Major, who was not selfish, was about to waken Paganel, that the geographer might witness the spectacle with his own eyes, when an unexpected sight stopped him. The phosphorescent light illumined the wood for the space of half a mile, and Mac Nab thought he saw shadows rapidly moving along the edge of the clearing. Did his eyes deceive him? Was he the sport of an illusion? He crouched down, and after a long and attentive observation, distinctly perceived several men, who seemed by their movements to be searching the ground for something. What could these men want? He must know, and without an instant's hesitation or awakening his companions, he crawled along on all fours, carefully concealing himself in the tall grass. Chapter 40. A startling discovery. Increasing perplexities. It was a terrible night. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the rain began to fall in torrents, which continued to pour from the stormy clouds till daylight. The tent was an insufficient shelter. Glenarvan and his companions took refuge in the cart, where they passed the time in conversing upon various subjects. The Major, however, whose short absence no one had noticed, contented himself with listening in silence. The fury of the tempest gave them considerable uneasiness, since it might cause an inundation, by which the cart, fast in the mire, would be overwhelmed. He crouched down, and after a long and attentive observation, distinctly perceived several men. More than once, Mulrady, Ayrton, and Captain Mangles went to ascertain the height of the rushing waters, and returned drenched from head to foot. At length day appeared. The rain ceased, but the rays of the sun failed to penetrate the thick veil of clouds. Large pools of muddy, yellowish water covered the ground. A warm vapor issued from the water-soaked earth and saturated the atmosphere with a sickly moisture. Glenarvan, first of all, turned his attention to the cart. In his eyes, this was their main support. It was embedded fast in the midst of a deep hollow of sticky clay. The 4 wheels were almost entirely out of sight, and the hind ones were buried up to the hubs. It would be a very difficult matter to pull out the heavy vehicle, and would undoubtedly require the united strength of men, oxen, and horses. "We must make haste," said Captain Mangles. "If this clay dries, the work will be more difficult." Glenarvan, the 2 sailors, the captain, and Ayrton then entered the wood, where the animals had passed the night. It was a tall forest of gloomy gum trees. Nothing met the eye but dead trunks, widely separated, which had been destitute of their bark for centuries. Not a bird built its nest on these lofty skeletons. Not a leaf trembled on the dry branches, that rattled together like a bundle of dry bones. Glenarvan, as he walked on, gazed at the leaden sky, against which the branches of the gum trees were sharply defined. To Ayrton's great astonishment, there was no trace of the horses and oxen in the place where he had left them. The fettered animals, however, could not have gone far. They searched for them in the wood but failed to find them. Ayrton then returned to the banks of the river, which was bordered by magnificent mimosas. He uttered a cry well known to his oxen, but there was no answer. The quartermaster seemed very anxious, and his companions glanced at each other in dismay. An hour passed in a vain search, and Glenarvan was returning to the cart, which was at least a mile off, when a neigh fell upon his ear, followed almost immediately by a bellow. "Here they are," cried Captain Mangles, forcing his way between the tall tufts of the gastrolobium, which were high enough to conceal a whole herd. Glenarvan, Mulrady, and Ayrton rushed after him, and soon shared his astonishment. 2 oxen and 3 horses lay upon the ground, stricken like the others. Their bodies were already cold, and a flock of hungry crows, croaking in the mimosas, waited for their unexpected prey. Glenarvan and his friends gazed at each other, and Wilson did not suppress an oath that rose to his lips.